In this lecture I'd like to talk about positional pawn sacrifices. In former times, of course, pawn sacrifices used to be much more about temporary advantages. Things like a lead in development or a swift attack on the king were very much the order of the day. More recently, chess has moved on, and the relationship between such temporary advantages and more permanent ones has become much better understood and more developed. As a consequence, while such pawn sacrifices still undoubtedly exist, the more common trend is for pawn sacrifices which also include an element of compensation based on more permanent factors. Today I'd like to look at two examples, in both of which white sacrifices a pawn, principally to improve the quality of the minor pieces which remain after exchanges. These strategies appear quite deep, and as we shall see, in both cases extremely effective. The first game comes from Vladimir Kramnik. It starts off as a fairly quiet, solid Queen's Indian defence, but I take it from the start of the game because the pawn sacrifice in fact occurs surprisingly early on. Kramnik's opponent, the very talented Armenian player Rafael Vaganyan, on this occasion chose a defence to White's opening which I wouldn't say is by any means Black's most reliable. This exchange of the knights on e4, in my opinion, somewhat simplifies White's task of obtaining at least a light initiative, and Kramnik, in keeping with his style, selects quite a solid option. In this position, Black's most solid option would probably have been simply to exchange the bishops on d3, but instead he played a rather more challenging and optimistic, but perhaps misguidedly optimistic move, allowing the exchange of his own bishop on e4. He was as aware of it as any of us that after the exchange and White's retreat forcing the move f5, the pawn on e6 could potentially become a weakness. However, he's resting his hopes, I suppose, on the fact that the pawns on light squares leave his dark squared bishop rather a good piece, and he's presumably hoping to reach some kind of blocked structure in the centre where White has difficulty himself making a good piece out of his remaining bishop. However, as you shall see, Kramnik has some other ideas and immediately breaks in the centre with the move f3. This puts something of a question to Black's strategy, since if he simply acquiesces in an exchange, White will again be able to develop quickly, hopefully break open the centre and cause some inconvenience to Black on the long diagonal. So Vaganyan finds a tactical means of preventing that for the time being by playing the move bishop d6, exploiting the fact that White has yet to castle. Kramnik threw in a clever little check on a4, the point of which we'll understand later. He does it at the moment where Black can't reply with queen d7 because the queen is needed to fulfill the tactical idea behind the last move bishop d6. Instead, Black felt obliged to play c6, and now White castled, forcing Black to continue with his active strategy again. If he simply acquiesces in a capture on f3, White has a very pleasant position. Instead, he hopes to make an aggressive thrust on the king side with queen h4, and now of course White is pretty much obliged to remove this central tension. If he plays h3, he'll probably get mated, and deservedly so, and if he plays g3, Black has at the very least a draw with the sacrifice, well, sort of sacrifice, bishop takes g3. Instead, White played the move f4. Now at first sight, if we look at the colour of the pawns, the colour of the squares onto which the pawns have recently moved, we'll see another black pawn has moved to a white square, and another white pawn has moved to a black square. At this point you might feel that Vaganyan's strategy of trying to prove his own bishop to be good and his opponent's bishop to be bad is paying dividends. However, if he believed this to be the case, it's a very short-lived victory. After the natural enough move castles, Kramnik came up with a really superb answer to all the needs of the position. To illustrate how good this, or how effective this pawn sacrifice is, just take a look for a moment at the bishop on c1 and the knight on d2, and then follow their progress through the next few moves. White played the excellent move pawn to c5. Note that amongst other things this takes advantage of black's slight deficit in development with the knight on b8. If the knight was already developed, somehow without the c-pawn being on prise, moves like bishop c7 might come into consideration. The problem is now that the a-pawn is pinned to the rook, so any such move would involve structural problems. So black is pretty much obliged to take on c5, and now we see the first improvement. White's minor piece takes up a really rather nice posting on c4. The queen retreats to defend the bishop. Black would be fairly happy at this stage if White were simply to take on d6 and allow him his own knight in contest with White's bishop, the fate of which is still somewhat unclear. Black is also offering an exchange sacrifice, knight b6, but in the event of grabbing the rook in the corner, the queen would be out of play and black would have plenty of time to develop counterplay in the centre. So Kramnik's consistent approach is to ignore all these tactical material temptations and to continue in positional mode in keeping with his sacrifice. Instead, he exchanged on c5, played the move b4. The bishop returns to d6 and now bishop b2. Oops. Now let's have a look at these two white minor pieces which I drew attention to before. Now the bishop has an absolutely glorious sweeping diagonal and the knight has an excellent outpost, untouchable by black pawns and influencing all parts of the board. I don't want to look at the whole game, I just want to take a few more moves and we'll just see how White continues to build his initiative. Black is able to exchange off his questionable c-pawn, but still he never recovers from this deficit in development, the knight being stuck on b8. And here he plays the excellent move queen b5, sometimes with ideas to enter into b7, sometimes still merely holding the knight. Black plays bishop b6, and now again. At this point Kramnik made a slight inaccuracy. He played the move a4, intending to put the bishop on a3. Apparently, detailed analysis shows, I certainly don't want to go into it here, that the move bishop e5 would have been even more effective. What's clear is that White certainly is in no mood to capture the bishop on b6 and exchange off any of his excellent minor pieces for a mere pawn. The best move would have been bishop e5, but in any case I think the picture which this position shows is a very graphic demonstration of the power of a pawn sacrifice.